December 16, 1944. The pre-dawn darkness of the Ardennes forest was shattered by the thunderous roar of German artillery. For 24 straight hours, the earth trembled under the impact of thousands of shells as Hitler launched his final desperate gamble on the Western Front. Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and at its spearhead was one of the most feared units in the entire German military, Kampfgruppe Peiper. SSOB Sturmbannführer. Jochen Peiper stood in the turret of his command tank, watching as his elite battle group prepared to punch through American lines like a steel fist through paper. At just 29 years old, this coldly handsome officer had already earned a reputation as one of the most ruthless and effective commanders in the Waffen-SS. His unit was the tip of the spear for the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and they had been given the most crucial mission of the entire offensive: smash through enemy defenses, race to the Meuse River, and seize the vital port of Antwerp. The force under Peiper's command was formidable beyond imagination. Over 100 tanks and armored vehicles, including the massive 70-ton Tiger II tanks of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion. Nearly 5,000 men, all of them elite SS soldiers who had survived the brutal campaigns on the Eastern Front. Self-propelled artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and mechanized infantry, everything needed to punch a hole through enemy lines and exploit it with devastating speed. But as Peiper's column began its advance through the narrow, snow-choked roads of the Ardennes, he had no idea that fate was about to deliver him into a confrontation with one of the most legendary American units of World War II. Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division. The opening hours of the German offensive had been a nightmare of delays and frustration for Kampfgruppe Peiper. The roads assigned to his battle group were barely suitable for bicycles, let alone 70-ton tanks. His vehicles were forced to travel in a single column nearly 25 kilometers long, creeping forward at a snail's pace through terrain that seemed designed to frustrate mechanized warfare. When Peiper complained about the impossible road conditions, his superior, Fritz Kugmer, delivered orders that would haunt the young SS officer for the rest of his life. "I don't care how and what you do, just make it to the Meuse, even if you've only one tank left. When you get there." Those words carried the weight of desperation that had infected the highest levels of the German command. Hitler's war was collapsing on all fronts. Soviet armies were grinding toward Berlin from the east, while Allied forces pressed against the German frontier from the west. This offensive represented Germany's last hope of avoiding total defeat. Either it would succeed in splitting the Allied coalition, or the Third Reich would face annihilation. Peiper understood the stakes perfectly. He had served as Heinrich Himmler's personal adjutant, had witnessed the brutal reality of Nazi racial policies on the Eastern Front, and knew better than most that defeat would mean the complete destruction of everything he had fought for. Failure was not an option. His orders were to reach the Meuse River bridges between Liege and WWII, and he intended to do exactly that, regardless of the cost in human life. The first 24 hours of the offensive seemed to vindicate German optimism. American units, caught completely off guard by the scale and ferocity of the attack, began retreating in confusion. Peiper's spearhead captured the town of Honsfeld, along with crucial American fuel supplies, then continued westward through Berlin toward their ultimate objective. But it was at the Bognes crossroads, near the Belgian town of Malmedy, that Kampfgruppe Peiper committed an atrocity that would forever stain its reputation. On December 17th, Peiper's men captured 84 American prisoners from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. Instead of processing them according to international law, the SS soldiers herded the Americans into a field and machine-gunned them in cold blood. The Malmedy massacre, as it became known, was not an aberration, but a characteristic expression of SS brutality. Peiper himself had been present at multiple war crimes on the Eastern Front, where the murder of prisoners and civilians was considered standard practice. The massacre served both practical and psychological purposes, eliminated witnesses, two German movements, while sending a clear message to other American units about what they could expect if they fell into SS hands. But the massacre also had unintended consequences. Word of the atrocity spread rapidly through American ranks, hardening resistance and convincing soldiers that surrender was not an option when fighting the Waffen-SS. The psychological warfare that the Germans hoped to achieve backfired spectacularly, creating an enemy determined to fight to the death rather than face capture. Meanwhile, in the town of Bastogne, Easy Company was preparing for what would become their finest hour. The men of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had been rushed to Belgium as part of the emergency response to the German offensive, arriving just in time to help defend the crucial crossroads. The controlled movement through the southern Ardennes was not just another Belgian town, it was the key to the entire battle. 7 major roads converged on the city, making it essential for the movement of men and supplies in either direction. If the Germans could capture Bastogne, they would control the road network needed to sustain their advance toward the Meuse. If the Americans could hold it, they would force the German spearheads to take longer, more difficult routes that would delay their advance and expose them to counterattack. The 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, found itself surrounded in Bastogne by December 20th. The German forces closing the ring included elements of multiple divisions, all of them determined to crush American resistance and clear the road to Antwerp. Among the units pressing toward the besieged city was Kampfgruppe Peiper, though Peiper himself was fighting his own desperate battles to the north. Easy Company, under the temporary command of Lieutenant Norman Dyke Jr., occupied positions in the Bois de Jacques woods northeast of Bastogne. To men who had parachuted into Normandy on D-Day, fought through the hedgerows of France, and survived Market Garden in Holland, now found themselves facing the elite of the German military in conditions that tested human endurance to its absolute limits. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing, turning the Ardennes forest into a frozen hell, where frostbite was as deadly an enemy as German bullets. The paratroopers huddled in foxholes carved from the frozen earth, sharing whatever warmth they could find while maintaining constant vigilance against German infiltrators. Many had not eaten a hot meal in days, and medical supplies were running dangerously low. But if the Americans were suffering, so were their enemies. Peiper's advance had stalled at the town of Stoumont, where determined resistance from the 30th Infantry Division had blocked his path to the Meuse. The narrow roads that had slowed his initial advance now became a trap, preventing him from maneuvering his heavy tanks and leaving his extended column vulnerable to air attack. The psychological pressure on both sides was enormous. German soldiers, indoctrinated with Nazi ideology and driven by years of brutal warfare, fought with the fanatical determination of men who believed they were defending their homeland against extinction. American troops, facing the possibility of annihilation in a frozen Belgian forest, drew strength from their training, their leadership, and their faith in eventual victory. It was in this crucible of suffering and violence that the true character of both forces would be tested. The SS soldiers of Kampfgruppe Peiper represented the pinnacle of Nazi military achievement, elite troops equipped with the finest weapons Germany could produce, led by officers trained in the most advanced tactical doctrines, and motivated by an ideology that viewed their enemies as subhuman. Easy Company represented something entirely different. Soldiers drawn from American cities and farms, trained in democratic values, and fighting for the liberation of Europe from tyranny. The first major engagement between elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper and Easy Company occurred on December 22nd, as German forces attempted to expand their perimeter around Bastogne. SS Panzergrenadiers, supported by Panther tanks, launched a carefully coordinated attack against American positions in the Jacques Woods, hoping to break through and establish a clear line of communication with other German units. The attack began before dawn, with German artillery shells screaming through the frozen air to explode among the American foxholes. The paratroopers, who had endured 3 days of constant shelling, pressed themselves deeper into their frozen positions as fragments of hot steel wind overhead. When the barrage lifted, the distinctive sound of Panther tank engines could be heard approaching through the forest. What followed was a battle that epitomized the savage nature of combat in the Ardennes. German infantry, advancing behind their tanks in the half-light of dawn, encountered American paratroopers who had no intention of retreating. The fighting was at close range, sometimes hand-to-hand, as both sides struggled for control of key positions in the snow-covered forest. Staff Sergeant Don Malarkey, one of Easy Company's most experienced non-commissioned officers, later described the battle as the most intense combat he had experienced in the entire war. German soldiers, he recalled, fought with a desperation born of knowledge that this was their last chance for victory. They advanced through machine gun fire, threw themselves against American positions with suicidal courage, and continued fighting even when wounded. But the Americans were equally determined. Technical Sergeant Carwood Lipton, temporarily commanding the company in the absence of Captain Richard Winters, moved constantly between positions, directing fire and ensuring that his men held their ground. When German infiltrators tried to outflank American positions, They were met by paratroopers who had learned their trade in the hedgerows of Normandy and the streets of Eindhoven. The battle raged for hours, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. German tanks, operating in the thick forest, found their mobility severely restricted and became vulnerable to American bazookas and anti-tank mines. SS infantry, despite their superior training and equipment, discovered that American paratroopers could match them in close-quarters combat. By afternoon, it became clear that the German attack had failed. SS casualties were heavy, and the survivors were forced to withdraw to their starting positions. Easy Company had held, but at a terrible cost. Several paratroopers had been killed, and many more were wounded in fighting that accomplished little, except to demonstrate that both sides were willing to die for their cause. The failure of this attack marked a turning point in Kampfgruppe Peiper's participation in the Battle of the Bulge. Peiper himself, cut off and running low on fuel, was fighting for his life at Stoumont, while his subordinate units struggled to maintain their positions around Bastogne. The lightning advance that was supposed to carry German forces to Antwerp had bogged down into a series of desperate holding actions against increasingly confident American defenders. On December 23, the weather finally cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to resume operations for the first time since the offensive began. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and dramatic. German soldiers, who had grown accustomed to moving without fear of air attack, suddenly found themselves exposed to devastating strikes by fighter bombers and medium bombers. For the Americans, the appearance of Allied aircraft overhead was like a gift from heaven. Supply drops began immediately, bringing desperately needed ammunition, medical supplies, and food to the defenders of Bastogne. More importantly, the resumption of air operations meant that German forces could no longer move freely during daylight hours, severely restricting their ability to coordinate attacks. Easy Company's next major engagement with SS forces came on January 13, 1945, when the company was ordered to attack the village of Foy as part of the American counteroffensive that would eventually drive German forces back across the Rhine. The attack on Foy represented a complete reversal of the military situation. Now, it was the Americans who were advancing, while German forces fought desperate defensive actions. The village of Foy had been occupied by elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division since late December, and the defenders had used their time well. SS engineers had constructed elaborate defensive positions, mined the approaches to the village, and positioned anti-tank guns at key intersections. The German defenders included some of the same SS Panzer Grenadiers who had fought against Easy Company in the Jacks Woods. Lieutenant Norman Dyke, still commanding Easy Company, was tasked with leading the assault on Foy. The attack plan called for 3 platoons to advance simultaneously against the village from different directions, while a 4th platoon from Item Company created a diversion along the main road. At 09:00 hours, Easy Company launched its attack across the snow-covered fields leading to Foy. Almost immediately, the advancing paratroopers came under intense fire from German machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The SS defenders, fighting from prepared positions, had clear fields of fire across the open ground and used them to devastating effect. The American attack quickly bogged down as casualties mounted and unit cohesion began to break down. Lieutenant Dyke, overwhelmed by the intensity of combat, began to show signs of psychological breakdown. His commands became confused and contradictory, and several paratroopers later reported that he seemed unable to cope with the situation. At approximately 1,100 hours, Lieutenant Ronald Spears of Dog Company was ordered to take command of Easy Company and complete the attack. Spears, a combat veteran with a reputation for aggressive leadership, immediately grasped the tactical situation and began reorganizing the stalled assault. What Spears did next became one of the most famous individual actions of the entire Battle of the Bulge to regain control of his scattered platoons and resume the attack. He ran across 200 yards of open ground under heavy German fire, rallied the forward elements, and then ran back to coordinate with the rear units. The feat was witnessed by dozens of soldiers from both companies and became legendary among the paratroopers. Under Spears' leadership, the attack on Foy resumed with renewed vigor. The paratroopers, inspired by their new commander's courage, pressed forward despite heavy casualties. House-to-house fighting erupted as American soldiers entered the village and began clearing German positions room by room. The SS defenders fought with characteristic determination, contesting every building and street corner, but they were outnumbered and outgunned, and gradually, American firepower began to tell. By 15:30 hours, Foy was in American hands. though at a cost of 6 Easy Company soldiers killed and many more wounded. The capture of Foy marked the beginning of the end for German resistance in the Ardennes. Kampfgruppe Peiper had long since been forced to abandon most of its heavy equipment and retreat on foot through the frozen forest. The survivors of the elite battle group that had begun the offensive with such confidence were now struggling, just to avoid capture as American forces pressed to their advantage on all fronts. Peiper himself managed to escape the closing Allied net, but his command was shattered beyond repair. Of the nearly 5,000 men who had begun the offensive with Kampfgruppe Peiper, fewer than 800 made it back to German lines. The tanks, artillery, and vehicles that represented years of German production had been abandoned in the Ardennes snow, where they would serve as monuments to the failure of Hitler's last gamble. For Easy Company, the battles around Bastogne, Foy represented both their finest hour and their greatest test. The paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy as young men emerged from the Ardennes as seasoned veterans who had faced the elite of the German military and prevailed. Their casualties had been heavy, beginning with approximately 121 officers and men. Only 63 remained active by the end of the Ardennes fighting. The human cost of these battles extended far beyond the immediate participants. Warren Muck, Francis Mellet, and 9 other members of Easy Company died in the fighting around Bastogne. Each death represented not just a military casualty but the loss of a son, brother, or husband whose family would bear the grief for decades to come, but their sacrifice had achieved something of immense importance. The failure of the Ardennes offensive marked the beginning of Nazi Germany's final collapse. Hitler's strategic reserves, committed to this last desperate gamble, had been shattered beyond repair. The road to Berlin now lay open to Allied forces, and the end of the war in Europe was merely a matter of time. The encounter between Kampfgruppe Peiper and Easy Company at Bastogne represented more than just another battle in World War II. Was a confrontation between two fundamentally different visions of human society, one based on racial supremacy and totalitarian control, the other on democratic values and individual freedom. The outcome of that confrontation helped determine not just the course of the war, but the shape of the post-war world. Johann Peiper's SS weren't supposed to leave the Ardennes alive. And in a very real sense, they didn't. The elite battle group that had been the pride of the Waffen-SS was destroyed in the frozen forests of Belgium. Its survivors scattered and demoralized. The men who did manage to escape carried with them the knowledge that Nazi Germany's military might had been broken by citizen soldiers who refused to yield. The paratroopers of Easy Company, meanwhile, had proven that democratic armies could match and exceed the performance of totalitarian forces. When the cause was just and leadership was competent, their victory in the Ardennes was not just a military success, but a vindication of the values for which they fought: freedom, justice, and the right of people to determine their own destiny. The snow that covered the Ardennes battlefields eventually melted, revealing the full extent of the carnage that had taken place during those desperate winter weeks. Hundreds of tanks and vehicles lay scattered across the landscape, their twisted metal bearing witness to the ferocity of the fighting. The forests were scarred by artillery craters and littered with the debris of war helmets, weapons, equipment, and personal effects that told the story of men who had fought and died far from home. In the years that followed, the Battle of the Bulge would be remembered as Hitler's last gamble, the moment when Nazi Germany's fate was sealed. But for those who lived through it, the battle was much more personal. It was about survival in impossible conditions, about loyalty to comrades, about finding the courage to advance when retreat seemed the only rational choice. The day Peiper met Easy Company at Bastogne was the day that two armies collided in one of history's most brutal winter battles. When the smoke cleared and the snow settled, it was clear that the elite SS forces weren't supposed to leave the Ardennes alive, and in the most important sense, they never did. Their defeat marked not just a military victory, but the triumph of democratic values over totalitarian ideology, a victory that would reshape the world for generations to come.